What do Spotify, Google Podcast, iHeartRadio, RadioPublic.com, and Pocket Cast all have in common? Me, the Conversation Piece podcast with Tequila. So go ahead and hit that notification button. Go ahead. I'll wait. All right, back to the show. So again, why am I doing profiles on Black people during Black History Month? Duh. No, kidding. Because I feel it's my duty to not only educate myself, but my nieces and nephews, for they're not being taught about themselves in school, especially in Florida, where the governor seems to think it lacks educational value. The night of the massacre, armed with 2 wooden sticks, Crispus was at the front of the crowd. He gave one stick to Patrick Heaton. The other found its way to Captain Thomas Preston. According to witness accounts, Crispus grabbed a soldier's bayonet and yelled to the crowd to soldier on. "Kill the dogs! Knock them over!" Then the soldier regained control of the bayonet and fired, striking him in the chest. 5 people, ATTUCKS among them, died. The soldiers were acquitted of the murder, but 2 soldiers were found guilty of manslaughter. After being branded on their hands, they were eventually released. Crispus is seen as a martyr in the American Revolution, and his funeral was befitting of one at that time. No non-white person received honors in death like this. Known as a double agent, James Armistead Lafayette. James was born into enslavement and spent most of his life living on a plantation in Virginia. This would serve to benefit later in life. War is costly, both in lives and monetarily. States above the Potomac River found it hard to find men to join the Revolutionary Army, so the enslaved were looked upon as a source to fill this necessity. In exchange for their service, the enslaved were promised freedom. This exchange, in James's case, came with a twist. Colonel Ty was a title of honorifics, not an official one. Born into bondage as Titus, he was the property of New Jersey Quaker John Corliss, who was known to be a harsh master. So, it's no surprise that Titus escaped. Instead of heading north, he headed south to Virginia, which was being governed by a British man by the name of Lord Dunmore. Lord Dunmore is controversial for floating the idea that any enslaved person who fought for the crown would be emancipated. The unit he established was the Ethiopian Regiment, and the Black Loyalists were used to support the war against rebellious colonists. Colonel Ty's raid was feared by most of the Patriot Army. Titus would not see upfront battle action. The British utilized his knowledge of New Jersey to their advantage. They wanted that territory, but it was situated between British-occupied New York and Patriot territory of Philadelphia. Ty led many raids and was known and respected as a capable leader, but one would prove fatal. The attack on Colt's Neck, the home of one Captain Joshua Jack Huddy, saw Huddy's defending his home from the Loyalists until they set his house on fire. Ty and his unit gathered up the prisoners and boarded a boat on the Shrewsbury River for their journey back to Sandy Hook. A local militia fired on the boat, causing confusion. In the hysteria, Huddy dove into the water and swam ashore. His only injury was a shot in the thigh. Colonel Ty was shot in the wrist. This would prove fatal, as the wound grew infected with tetanus. Colonel Ty would succumb to his injuries a few days later. Peter Salem was born in Massachusetts on October 1st, 1750. 25 years later, he would find himself enlisting in the Revolutionary Army as a Black Minuteman. Other Black Minutemen included Titus Colburn, Seymour Burr, and Salem Poor, who Peter Salem is often confused with. The confusion is over the fatal shot delivered to British Major John Pitcairn. Either way, the incident was a major turning point in the war, even though the Battle of Bunker Hill eventually was won by the British. Peter Salem fought in the New York Campaign, Battle of Harlem Heights, Battle of Trenton, Battle of Saratoga, Battle of Monmouth, and Stony Point. He would eventually stop fighting on March 1st, 1780. The black men who fought in a Revolutionary War seemed to have a common thread: born an enslaved person only to transcend to a hero. And without their heroism, America might have become a completely different country than the one we have today. Another brave soul in the American Revolutionary War was Salem Poor, often confused with Peter Salem, another hero who fought for the Patriot Army. Poor was born in Andover, Massachusetts, as an enslaved person on a farm owned by John and Rebecca Poor. But Salem was able to purchase his freedom in 1769 for 27 pounds, or in today's value, about $5,600. Back then, that was a year's salary. He fell in love with Nancy Parker, a free mulatto woman who was a maidservant to Captain James Parker. In 1771, they married and had a son, Jonas. When a shot heard around the world was fired, Poor would enlist in the army and join the Massachusetts Minutemen, commanded by Captain James Fry. Minutemen were known for being battle-ready at a moment's notice, and it was at the Battle of Bunker Hill that Poor made his mark. Poor is credited with killing Colonel Abercrombie, in addition to numerous other British soldiers. This incident is captured in a famous painting by John Trumbull's Battle at Bunker Hill, in which British General Joseph Warren is fatally shot and Abercrombie is lying dead at his feet. How did the name Mary Elizabeth Bowers come about? What is known about Mary Jane Richards Denman? Mary Jane Richards was born an enslaved person, and the family that owned her, the Van Lews, were part of the wealthy elite in Virginia. They must have realized that Mary Jane was special, as she was formally baptized in 1846 and sent to Princeton for an education. Elizabeth Van Lew was vehemently anti-slavery and eventually became a spy herself. She used her family's money and influence to establish a network of spies, both black and white. Mary Jane Richards came back to Virginia on the eve of the Civil War and found herself working within the spy network. Legend would have Mary Jane Richards infiltrating the Jefferson Davis home, spying on the Confederate president, and relaying the intel back to the Union Army. And although this is true, the name given years later turned controversial, as history would record her as Mary Elizabeth Bowers. A niece of Elizabeth Van Lew, in 1910, gave the name of Mary Elizabeth Bowers to William Baymer, who was going to publish the name of a slave who infiltrated the Jefferson Davis mansion. Mary Jane Richards did not use the name of Bowers at the time. The only finding of Mary Jane Bowers was back in 1861, when Wilson Bowers and Mary, both enslaved servants of Mrs. E. L. Van Lew, who is Elizabeth's mother, married at St. John's on Richard Church Hill. By the time the war ended, Mary was using the name Miss Mary Richards. Did the niece give the wrong name on purpose? Or did she combine Elizabeth and Mary's names, as the two did work closely together as spies during the Civil War? But Elizabeth Van Lew was the only one who was financially compensated for her intel after the war was over. Maybe this was a way of protecting Mary Jane Richards' identity, as she was part of their family, one they held dear. No one knows for certain, but there is growing intrigue and misinformation circulating surrounding the name of Mary Elizabeth Bower. George Washington did not want black soldiers in the Continental Army. He wanted black soldiers banned from enlisting. He thought that by arming black soldiers, they would incite riots and rebellions and scare Southern slaveholders. The Continental Army had difficulty recruiting fresh bodies. He was desperate. He wrote to Congress begging for support. Not enough white men could be persuaded to enlist, so Congress instituted the draft, and each state had to fill a quota based on their population. Rhode Island has always been a small state, and at the time had a population under 60,000, but this was still not enough, and war was coming. An idea of 2 battalions, one white and one of black soldiers, both free and enslaved. When the Slave Enlistment Act passed in February 1778, stipulating that any enslaved person accepted to the 1st Rhode Island Regiment had to be, quote, immediately discharged from the service of his master or mistress and be absolutely free, as though he had never been encumbered without any kind of servitude or slavery, end quote. The 1st Rhode Island Regiment, also known as the 1st Black Battalion in the U.S., was established. Though small, their impact was immense and immediate. Wonder from whence my love of freedom sprang? Whence flow these wishes for the common good? By feeling hearts alone best understood. I, young in life, by seeming cruel fate, was snatched from Africa's fancied happy seat. Such my case. And can I then but pray others may never feel tyrannic sway? Those are the words of Phyllis Wheatley, a poem where she directly attacked the institution of chattel slavery. Born in Gambia and then kidnapped at the age of 7 or 8, her journey to America would materialize in her becoming a globally recognized African-American poet whose words impressed the likes of George Washington, Benjamin Franklin, and then the rest of the world. Phyllis was a gifted individual. In fact, she was so gifted with the written word that colonial printers doubted an enslaved woman could write poetry of a caliber she was known for. On October 8, 1772, a panel of 18 had convened to verify the authenticity of Phyllis's poetry. It is important to note that among these 18 were slave owners and even the governor of Massachusetts. The panel was assembled by the family that owned her at the time, John Wheatley, who intervened after she had difficulty getting her poetry published. She eventually was published with the help of Susan Wheatley's British friends, and in 1773 published a collection of poetry. 2 years later, her stance on anti-slavery saw another one of her poems, Modern Egyptian, equate the pharaohs with slave owners. In every human breast, God has implanted a principle which we call love of freedom. It is impatient of oppression and pants for deliverance. And by the leave of our modern Egyptians, I will assert that the same principle lives in us. Throughout this series of the Black Revolutionary Heroes, I mentioned how George Washington didn't want black soldiers to enlist. He was of the opinion that by arming Negroes, they would use the weaponry as a chance to stage rebellions and free enslaved people. Phyllis wrote a poem during the Revolutionary War, hoping that it would appeal to the better angel of Washington, and he would in turn apply those principles of equality and liberation to enslaved people. It reads, "One century scarce performed its destined round, when Gallic powers Columbia's fury found, and so may you, whoever dares disgrace the land of freedom's heaven-defended race." Thank you again for tuning in to another episode of the Conversation Piece Podcast. I am your humble host, Akila, requesting that you join me again. So, until then, be safe, love, and value yourself so that you can love and value others. I bid you adieu with the greeting, Assalamu alaikum, peace be with you.